consequences. I want to talk to you, though, about the principal thing that occupies my mind still from my experience of government, and in respect of which the public service played an extremely important role, and where it will play an extremely important role in the future, and that's the issue of climate change. I was the Assistant Minister to Senator Penny Wong, well known to all of you, for I think from 2009 up to the 2010 election, and then I was the Minister for Climate Change from 2010 until 2013. So, in fact, most, excuse me, most of the time I was in Parliament, I had a climate change responsibility. And this is a complex, diabolical, difficult public policy issue, quite aside from consideration of the complexity and difficulty of the politics associated with it. And one where, I've got a drink, thanks, if that's what you were thinking. Yeah, thank you. No, and one where the quality and the integrity and the strength of the public service advice is really fundamentally important. And I was very fortunate to have advice of that quality while I was Minister. And it's one important reason why, despite all of the difficulties and the barriers we had, we were able to successfully legislate a carbon pricing scheme, along with a host of other measures, many of which have so far survived the election of the Abbott government. And just to go back to TORS, for those of you less familiar with the policy challenge this is, I had the opportunity as Minister to interface with many eminent scientists, and I know that it is put in community debate and in media debate that of course the science isn't settled. You'll hear the Prime Minister say that. I think that's crap, actually. He describes the science as crap. I describe that assertion as crap. It was a great privilege to meet them. Many internationally acknowledged scientists who work in this field, and the opportunity to speak with them, to take their advice, to have their participation in the formulation of policy, to test the counter-arguments, I think in a thoroughly professional manner. And I have no doubt that the advice that governments are receiving all around the world from scientists is advice that governments must act upon. And essentially that advice is that increasing greenhouse gas emissions are causing temperature increases. They are causing and contributing to more frequent extreme weather events, the acidification of oceans. And it was a curiosity to me that at the time that the Australian Parliament was repealing the carbon price legislation in July this year, on the other side of the world, the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration was issuing yet another piece of global temperature data that was indicating that climate change is upon us. And what they released is that for June, the combined average temperatures over land and sea were 0.72 degrees above the 20th century average of 15.5 degrees. That made it the hottest June, on average, internationally, that had been measured, adding to the hottest ever May, adding to the equal hottest April ever recorded as well. And June this year, globally, was the 352nd month when global temperatures were above the 20th century average, and the last below average month was in February 1985. And that's one piece of data I can point to, and other scientists will point to something else. But essentially, the international scientific evidence conclusion of those qualified to make these observations is that climate change is a reality that we do have to deal with. The concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is now higher than at any time in the last 800,000 years. And it's unequivocal that those emissions have risen very sharply since pre-industrial times, and the evidence is clearly that global average temperatures have increased. When governments receive advice of this nature, in all its complexity, There is a public policy imperative on behalf of the people that governments represent to act upon it, in my judgment. I simply don't see that it's responsible to ignore it or to denigrate it when there is no ground to do so. And in fact, I think some who refuse to accept the science are simply putting politics and ideology ahead of science, self-evidently so. It's a bit like the medieval church confronted with Galileo's astronomical observations. You know, and we've got important independent institutions in Australia like the CSIRO, like the Bureau of Meteorology, and many others internationally that are all saying the same thing, providing the same advice to governments. And that is why it is inevitable, despite the ups and downs and the ins and outs of politics and the political contest in one democracy like ours, that is why internationally there is only one direction in policy for this, and that is that governments all around the world, in one way or the other, are considering means of cutting greenhouse gas emissions and endeavouring to look at the principles upon which they should do that. And the principles that Labor followed in government were, I think, pretty evident ones that needed to be followed, and that is that we needed a credible effort, a credible public policy reform that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions and be able to achieve a targeted cut in our emissions, and that we must do that at lowest cost to our economy in the most efficient way we possibly can. Those are the obvious principles to follow. But for a Labor government and a Labor minister, there's a third principle, and that is to enact a reform like this in a socially fair and equitable manner. That is, where there is a cost involved, it is important to ensure that it doesn't incur in the society in an inequitable way and punish those least able to pay for it. So those were the three principles that we followed, and those are the three principles that early on, when I became Minister after the 2010 election, I articulated to the public servants who were supporting me, who included some of the best and brightest in the Commonwealth Public Service, people who by and large had spent a considerable period of time in the Federal Treasury and who wanted to contribute to a public policy reform that actually is in a neoclassical economic tradition, and that is pricing carbon. Letting the work be done by a price signal in a market economy. Not too radical, actually, pretty straightforward, and you'd think the Conservative side of politics would agree with that proposition, but ultimately, of course, they did not. And going about doing this, making a reform of this nature, we examined all of the policy options that might satisfy those principles for the policy formulation. We first, of course, set up a committee comprising various representatives of Parliament in order to be able to ensure that the public policy approach we adopted could be legislated. And that is why the government effectively set up a committee of cabinet that comprised not only the Prime Minister, Treasurer and myself, but which also comprised Bob Brown and Christine Milne from the Greens, and two independent MPs, Rob Oakeshott and Tony Windsor. With their support, if we were able to obtain it, we knew we would have a majority in both houses of Parliament to enact the reform. And it was a little bit of an unusual way of approaching it, and it also led to very significant political issues that contributed to the ultimate repeal of the carbon pricing legislation. The short story was that we opted for, I think, and I remain committed to, the best public policy approach to dealing with this issue, and that is an internationally linked emissions trading scheme. And for those of you less conversant with the ins and outs of emissions trading, this is essentially like a reasonably simple concept. It's to say to the largest emitters of greenhouse gases in the economy that you will be required by law to buy a permit for every tonne of greenhouse gas that you emit. And the carbon price that you hear of is essentially the price of the permit. This is not a novel thing. We do this in other parts of public policy. And so an aluminium smelter, for example, is going to be required to purchase a permit for every tonne of greenhouse gas emissions that they contributed as a consequence of the smelting of aluminium, which is a very electricity intensive operation. The price of that permit is determined at an auction. It's a floating price, so that the government would auction a certain number of permits each year. Those companies would bid for them on an electronic bidding system, and the auction process would determine the carbon price, the price for each permit that is issued. That price would also be influenced by the extent to which the emissions trading scheme was linked with an overseas scheme. And in this case, we negotiated a treaty with the European Union. They have an emissions trading scheme that covers 30 economies, and excuse me, the treaty provided that a company in Europe could purchase a permit in the Australian auction, and a company in Australia could purchase a permit in the European Union auctions, which take place. And in that way, between our economy and the European economies, the carbon price would be the same, because each would be bidding on an electronic basis in those auctions for permits, and it would be one marketplace with one carbon price. That way you eliminate the competitive disadvantage that can arise by carbon pricing in your economy with the economy of your trading partners. Ultimately, China will introduce an emissions trading scheme across its economy next year. The Australian government had a very significant degree of involvement in the design of that scheme with China for the purpose that it, being our #1 trading partner, and the European bloc being our #2 trading partner, that we would join with the Chinese emissions trading scheme as well, so that with our 2 largest trading partners, there would be a common carbon price. And to that in time, we would add South Korea, our 4th largest trading partner, which is introducing an ETS next year as well. And to that we'd add California, which has an ETS in place already, the 8th largest economy in the world. And to that we would add a linkage to emissions trading schemes in various provinces in Canada. And as the international community continues to move in implementing carbon pricing in different jurisdictions, we would link with those as well. The objective being that a whole host of economies have a cap on their level of emissions, and an emissions trading scheme that's internationally linked with a common carbon price. The way that the cap is achieved in each economy is to limit the number of permits that are issued, and so that each year the government can say, we'll only issue 500 million permits this year. You have to bid for them, and the European Union does the same thing. The next year you say it's 450 million permits, and that way you can be sure under an ETS of bringing a cap down on your greenhouse gas emissions. So that's what it was all about, and that's actually what we legislated. It was not a carbon tax, as became the common vernacular. The great political mistake that we needed to make, or policy mistake that led to very toxic politics, was that in order to get the Greens agreement to introduce an ETS of that nature, we could not agree with them what the cap on emissions should be. Because the Greens, of course, have a slightly different approach to Labor, like a profoundly different approach. They're quite happy to kill particular industries in our economy, pretty much with the back of the axe, in order to get greenhouse gas emissions down quickly. And Labor would never agree with that. This was always to be a gradualist approach to emissions reduction. Because we couldn't agree on the caps, the targeted emissions reductions, we decided to introduce the ETS with a 3-year fixed price, which operates like a carbon tax. And that's where that politically toxic tag came from. There was an ETS with a fixed price for 3 years in introducing it, and whenever you fix a price and the rest of the world's on a floating arrangement like the European Union, you're vulnerable to differentials in price and allegations, of course, that you're competitively disadvantaging your own economy. At the time that we announced our package and our fixed price, the fixed price we had was as close as I could get it to the European Union floating price. Within several months, the European Union price collapsed with some more reverberations of the global financial crisis through their economies. and we ended up with a very significant differential that was glaringly obvious and exposed the full extent of the difficulty of having had to make that agreement with the Greens for a 3-year fixed price to get around the impasse we had with them. And ultimately, I think that contributed a lot to the repeal of the policy position. I frankly don't know what I would do differently. You know, that was the nature of the Parliament. If we were going to make that reform, then we had to make compromises to get it through. It's just the nature of the beast. Some people here might even vote Green. For God's sake, will you vote Labor instead? They make life bloody hard with their lunatic sort of policy propositions. You know, but unfortunately, at that point in time, they held the balance of power in the Senate, and we had to make compromises. People have, of course, rightly criticise me as Minister that you should have done more to you know, engage in the public relations battle and to defeat Tony Abbott's attack on the carbon tax and try and overcome that. Well, we did the best we could, and herein lies another lesson, important lesson for me, that's worth reflecting upon. I think I had 9 staff as a Minister who could work on the legislation, on everything that went with it, and it nearly killed them making that reform, and nearly killed me too. But my staff couldn't have worked harder. I don't think I could have worked harder either. The public servants couldn't have worked harder, because it's such an incredibly complex piece of public policy. And if we're to make policy changes like that, huge reforms in our society, we've got to think more carefully about how we resource the effort to do so, both at a public service level and at an executive of government level. Partly this failed because we don't resource government the right way when there are major challenges of this nature. You know, I had to fight like buggery to try and sustain the number of public servants that I had in my department, yet this was the flagship reform of the government. You know, I had to fight like buggery just to try and get an extra, you know, 1 FTE in my ministerial office to be able to deal with the challenges that we had. I had less resources available to me as a minister to fight a public relations campaign than I had as an ACTU leader. You know, and I thought it just ridiculous. And that's a contributing factor to why we couldn't get on top of this. I don't mean to be making excuses about it, but those are some reasons. Quite aside from that, there's some instructive lessons as well for public policy makers in the conduct of this reform and for the prospects of future reforms. And the main one that I'd like to draw out for you was the role and importance of vested interests. Of course, it's a democracy and there's vested interests. And when I was a union official, there are vested interests. But the power in our society, in our economy and our democracy of particular interests is quite profound when they turn their mind to defeating public policy reforms. And in this event, of course, we had the fossil fuels industry, and particularly coal mining companies, who were bitterly opposed to this, notwithstanding the fact that they are hypocrites because they've been factoring in a shadow carbon price in their investment decisions for many years. But nonetheless, a bit like the tobacco industry, they saw the importance of defeating this wherever it raises its ugly head. And they played a very important role in cultivating the opposition to this particular public policy reform. Then you've got various political interests too, and this is a News Corporation town with the Adelaide Advertiser, for example. In their tabloids in the Sydney and Melbourne market in particular, but they would have given it a good go here, News Corp leadership wanted to defeat the Labor government. You know, that's their political position. Carbon pricing gave them an opportunity to really prosecute an agenda to do that, to attack Labor in its core with working class people, and to frighten and terrify them about the cost of living implications of carbon pricing and distort and deceive in every way imaginable, and that's what they did. And it's a very powerful interest in our democracy that you need to be mindful of. You know, and it's a very hard thing in government to overcome powerful vested interests, whether they're fossil fuel companies, aluminium smelters, chemical manufacturers, plastics manufacturers, and the host of the rest, who all joined up to deceive the community about the true implications of carbon pricing. When they marry up with News Corporation, you've got a pretty big agenda running against you. And that was another powerful influence in this equation. I've got to give Tony Abbott his due though too. I mean, he took all of that and ran with it and ran an enormously successful campaign against carbon pricing for his own political ends. Now, this is a man who had advocated a carbon tax, by the way, while in the Howard government. It's a man who had supported an emissions trading scheme while in the Howard government and in opposition under Brendan Nelson and Malcolm Turnbull's leadership, but who, when he saw an opportunity, as populist opportunist politicians do, to attack this policy because of its potential toxicity in the community, he did so very successfully. And I think he's easily the most successful opposition leader we've seen for a long time in federal politics, and a very much underestimated politician, I think. Add him to those other influences that I've spoken about, and you start to get some explanation as to why this public policy reform, as important as it is, hit the rocks. In that, the independence, the integrity, the intelligence, the resilience of the public service is extremely important. With all of those pressures whirling around, and the public servants they were very wedded to the reform that we were making, and they used to be concerned with me at times about how badly the politics were going, and they could see the risk to their hard work. I just used to say to them, like, that's my worry, right? That's not yours. Just give me the best advice you can to support the policy initiatives that we are prosecuting. But don't get engaged in the politics, and that is exactly what they didn't do. They did not get engaged in the politics. And I think making that reform, even though at a political level it was not ultimately successful, it was an enormously successful effort at a very complex piece of public policy, and I'm enormously grateful to the support that I got. And I learned a lot from that, and those of you in the public service who are here today can learn a lot from that too. No matter how awful it looks outside or how vested you may be personally in something, the most important thing you can do for the executive of government is to provide strong, independent, fearless advice and the ideas, to support public policy. Don't leave it up to, ministerial advisors to be the fonts of wisdom on everything. Of course, they're very wise, and ministers who are even more sage. But the executive government performs best when it's getting ideas from the public service, and that address in a sensible way the policies that the government may wish to pursue. And that was what I had the privilege of receiving from the public service in Canberra in relation to this very difficult reform. Just finally on that, it's for the reasons I described about the science and the dynamic that's going on internationally about climate change, it is absolutely inevitable that a future parliament federally will be legislating an internationally linked emissions trading scheme. It is the most sound public policy response, and it will come back and the parliament will legislate it. And the thing that sustains me out of that experience in particular is that it's all done. It'll need to be updated, but all of the detailed work of incredibly dense, detailed negotiations with numerous industries and businesses, an understanding of how it works, all the work's done. In fact, carbon pricing was in place for 2 years during the fixed price period at a level well in excess of that in other jurisdictions, and it didn't destroy the economy. The world didn't come to an end. In fact, it worked. The emissions intensity of our electricity system in particular was reduced, and reduced substantially, and carbon pricing had a big hand in that. I'm now working in South Australia, as you are aware, on another pretty big economic challenge for this state, and that is the closure of the automotive manufacturing sector. And I won't speak much about that. You may wish to ask me some questions later about it, but this is fast forward 30 years from work that Dr. Russell, the Chief Executive of the Department of State Development, was doing 30 years ago, helping to bring down tariffs and reform the Australian economy in a tremendously important, historic set of reforms in the Hawke-Keating period. This is just another, long-term consequence that we're confronting. Essentially what was done when tariffs came down in the auto sector and continue to come down is that the support for the industry went onto the government's balance sheet, and direct subsidies, if you like, were paid to auto manufacturers and component suppliers, and those subsidies were tightened and tightened and tightened, and the industry contracted and contracted, and ultimately the issue of scale, there's just not enough scale in the domestic market. And Australian motor vehicles purchased by the Australian community don't have the same meaning that they did decades ago. We're well away from the Kingswood period. People voted with their wallets, and were buying imported motor vehicles. But what was being done was an industry policy assistance to that industry that was allowing it to contract in a predictable way and allowing the workforce to adjust in a predictable way. Each year, people were being made redundant in the auto sector in Victoria and South Australia. Businesses were closing, but it wasn't the back of the axe. And I was at least anticipating, I was Industry Minister up to just before the 2013 election, I was anticipating that we would be able to allow that adjustment process to go through to about 2020, 2022. I'd have been surprised if we found a way for the industry to continue after that point in time, but I was confident that it would up until that horizon. However, the new government decided to hit it with the back of the axe, and so the industry will close in 2017, if not before. That's a really big challenge and one that's regrettable to have to deal with in such a sudden way. We're doing a couple of things that are important amongst many things. One of them is, what I've learned over the years, the most important thing you can do in these circumstances is to support the employees who are affected by it. People will have lots of ideas. Let's get a new motor vehicle manufacturer, let's find some new industry, let's pay a subsidy to someone to come and provide jobs. All that aside, the most important thing you can do is to recognise the skills that those people have, in a formal sense recognise them, help equip them with additional skills that are going to be needed in the South Australian labour market, look around where private sector investment is being made, in which industries, in which sort of products and capabilities, what sort of skills are they demanding, and try to start to steer people towards where the labour force and the economy will grow. There are no magic bullets. So we're putting a lot of attention into programs to support employees in that way. The other thing that we are doing is offering support to the auto component manufacturers. Of course, there are many in South Australia, hundreds of them, maybe 13,000 people employed by them. We're offering support to companies that have got the go in them, the entrepreneurial capacity to diversify their business. And, in actuality, if they haven't been doing that in recent years, then they can't read tea leaves very well. What we will find is that many companies will simply close, and particularly companies that are part of an international operation in the auto industry. They don't want to suddenly become suppliers to a mining operation in their offshoot in Australia. They'll just stay in the industry and concentrate on the big markets. Those businesses will close here. But some locally owned businesses have been diversifying, have looked for new markets, have been successful in doing so, have reduced their dependence upon auto industry revenue, and others over the next couple of years may also be able to do that. And the programs that we've designed in the department are to support that process, to support the ones that have got the go in them to do it. We haven't got enough money to waste on businesses that are not serious about endeavouring to diversify. So we're taking a very hard-headed view about it. They're the two main things we're doing. Our work marries up with the work of the Economic Development Board and other agencies within government that are looking to support the continuing economic development and diversification of the state. I think there are great opportunities and cause for optimism, not pessimism, about what the future might look like. So that's broadly what I'm doing. Same thing again. What I've found coming here is a really good quality public service led by tremendously talented and committed people, and I know how much of a difference that makes from the experience that I have. And so I'm just endeavouring to do the best I can do to impart some of my experience to those with whom I'm working on this issue at the moment. There's not going to be a magic solution to it, and the solution's not likely to be found in providing, you know, massive subsidies to someone else to come in and make a car, you know, given all the experience we've got. And I know there'll be a temptation to be seduced by things like that. Might sound good, but you have to look at it from a hard-headed public policy point of view. And that's what the public service in particular has got to do. Even if, and I'm not suggesting this is the case, but even if people in the executive of government might think that's, you know, a good ready solution to do something like that, the public service has got a responsibility to say, well, hang on, let's have a look at this properly. You know, might it be more efficient actually for us to support investment in biotechnology or in mine services or the agricultural industry? You know, what way are we going to encourage research and development and innovation which will really drive competitive businesses in the state, and which is where we should be taking people with their skills? So that's what we're doing at the moment. But just in conclusion, you know, in respect to what Don Dunstan, I think, contributed to the public service in South Australia, the importance of independence, the importance of great quality leadership, the importance of providing fearless advice to the executive of government, all of these are fundamental to the successful functioning of our democratic system. And I can only emphasise to you that in everything that I've described in which I've been involved, that's been central. It's a very important democratic value that we should continue to adhere to. So thanks for your patience, and I'll be happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Perhaps just to start with, Greg, you were talking about vested interests and about being able to deal with public policy issues. Are we still able to have reforming governments in the climate of the current level of public debate?
I think the answer to that is yes. But Paul Kelly, who you may be aware, has written a book, Triumph and Demise, about the period of Labor in government. One of his conclusions in that book, it's not as good as the book over in the corner, by the way. It's much more insightful. But one of Paul's conclusions is that it's basically impossible to do big reforms now. I don't think so, actually. I think if you consider some of the lessons that I was just describing in relation to big reform like carbon pricing, but many of the other things that are attempted, you've just got to build a democratic platform for it. One of the things I didn't say about carbon pricing is that the community, of course, perceived that we did not have a mandate to do that. So a democratic basis for doing things is important. That takes gutsy political leadership, particularly if you're trying to win government from opposition to advocate a big reform. But I think it can be done. The quality of leadership is really important. The engagement with the business community is very important. I think business in Australia has got to stand up to be counted. You know, there's no point whinging and moaning in the Fin Review that there's no productivity agenda, and then yet when you know, the hard yards come along, the business community goes missing in action. You know, doesn't back up the political leadership that's looking to make the reforms. That's not good enough, and that's what's been happening. So I think good leadership, democratic platform, mustering stakeholders, and sensible policy propositions that are properly founded in the appropriate principle, but particularly you know, economic efficiency is very important to inform that. I think you can do it. I'm going to be very interested in the lead up to the next election because, as I said, I think Tony Abbott's much underestimated. He got in on an oppositionist, populist platform that I thought was pretty at the limits of irresponsibility. Now he's got the responsibility of government. He's now finding, of course, there's no debt and deficit disaster, there's actually a revenue disaster. So terms of trade are still coming off, iron ore prices still coming down. I don't know what that means. The Commonwealth budget's so sensitive in revenue, in receipts, to where resource prices are at. They would now be looking at the mid-year economic review, a widening deficit. And he's now, he can't blame Labor for this anymore. That's his responsibility. But I reckon he's going to be looking at all that and thinking, I've got to be thinking about genuine structural reforms here, and I have to make the case for them to win a mandate at the next election. I'm going to be very interested to see if he actually takes that on. I don't think Joe Hockey can do it, only Abbott can do it. And if he does take that on and win, I mean, I obviously may not agree with what reform program he might have, most likely not to. But if he does take it on and make changes off the back of a mandate, that would be a pretty interesting outcome. John Howard was capable of doing it, and of course so were Hawke and Keating in particular.
So how do you, just thinking about public debate, and you've talked about mainstream media, we're more and more dealing with social media, and mainstream media, in my view, seems to be moving more from reporting to opinion. How do you engage those, the broader social media and get reasonable or informed debate?
Well, I'm probably the worst person to ask because I hate Twitter. I've never tweeted. I don't have a Facebook page or anything else. I'm old-fashioned about it. I still think, the political leadership is still on the news, on every channel, every night. Free-to-air TV is still widely watched. Advertising is important. I don't oppose advertising by government, so within proper guidelines to promote major changes that are genuinely in the interests of the community. There are ways of communicating to the society. Everyone will use Twitter and Facebook and everything else, social media outlets, to try and prosecute that as well. But to make big changes, you have to speak to the community over a long period of time. And that means using free media opportunity in particular. And I just reckon the capability's there to do it. It takes guts to do it. You can see what can be done with sort of crass political oppositionism, as Tony Abbott is so brilliant at. But, I'd like to see him turn his talents to constructive, political leadership to make changes that are in the interests of the country.
I'll ask you a question. Just going back to the climate change issue, I'm a mayor of the city. I'm also the national president of ALGA. So tomorrow...
Oh, congratulations. Yeah.
So okay. I've been talking to my bureaucrats about how do we try and get some traction around the ministerial councils to get the Environment and Water Ministerial Council back on the agenda, because all of those councils and the working parties have all gone. So all the work around adaptation and mitigation is now being moved into the natural disaster space and moved over to Minister Keenan. So I guess my question is, how do we help the Prime Minister reposition himself? Because as you say, we've got Paris next year, and the word is that the USA and China will put something out before then about how they're going to approach the scheme. How do we help him to backflip without the media saying that he's done a backflip? Because I'd really like to talk to him about that over lunch on Friday. Because it's an opportunity. If we can provide him with a way to do that without everyone saying, the world's going to end, he's changed his mind.
I don't know that that's avoidable, the backflip accusation. In fact, I might even say that myself. But no, I think if you do have that opportunity, it's important to explain the reality for councils, what it means for insurance, your practical, economic, commercial issues, the funding that you need to deal with things. You know, coastal councils in particular around the country are facing huge cost imposts. They can't possibly finance, property values at risk, blah, blah. You know, we know a lot of the infrastructure that's going to need to be built. I think that message has got to be repeated and repeated and repeated. That's got to be explained to all parliamentarians, including, you know, on the Labor side of politics. They need to be partisan about it. And the Prime Minister needs to understand, you know, he's leading this country and has a responsibility to attend to the real things, not the bullshit, you know, and the political crap that goes on, but as the Prime Minister of the country, you have a heavy burden of responsibility to address the real things and the advice that the government receives about them, and to coalesce, you know, in your position, to coalesce with business groups who might be like-minded, with the insurers, for example, the other, you know, and the banks. There are many large institutions in our society that recognise that we need to do this. I even saw, you know, some of the mining companies sometimes annoy me. I even saw Andrew Mackenzie making a comment, the head of BHP Billiton, that, you know, the company is really well positioned to deal with international action on climate change and carbon pricing that is likely to come maybe in the nearer rather than the distant future. And of course, his executives are in berating me and the Prime Minister and the Treasurer and giving us the rounds of the kitchens, how terrible carbon pricing was. But the truth is that all those companies know that these reforms, they operate internationally, they know what's going on internationally. They know too that the significance of the shale gas revolution in the US now means that the US can achieve its emissions reductions targets, and possibly quite easily, and overshoot them. And it can take a much more, as a consequence, aggressive stance in the international negotiations and stand up to China. Because previously China has been pointing at the US, saying, you're not doing anything, you know. If the US is in a position now to go to the international meetings and say, we'll meet our targets and we can be more aggressive, what's the rest of you doing? The Western countries in particular, you know, Australia will be very, very isolated in that environment, and I think Tony Abbott would be getting a sense of that now from his international engagement. And you just got to move forward with these things. And it's like I've said about the repeal of carbon pricing, you see it in context and for what it was. It was a vehicle for Tony Abbott to win government. You know, that was the only reason for it, that campaign. He doesn't believe all that crap. He knew it was rubbish at the time. So in time, he's got to reposition, and it's easier to do so if there's a coalition of interests around saying, actually, we've got to do this.
Any other questions?
Greg, I'll be interested in your thoughts, but with Australia's, I suppose, responsibility in the Asia-Pacific region, how we should respond to, I suppose, future climate change refugees and what Australia's policy should be?
Well, it's funny you ask me. When you're in the UN negotiations, you get partnered up as an advanced economy with a developing economy minister counterpart. And I was always partnered up with the minister from Bangladesh, who was a really lovely man, very intelligent person. And he was just describing to me the extent of the problem they are facing. Look, it's massive, and that's only one place. They've got millions and millions of people who live in areas that are less than a metre above sea level, and they are already being displaced, not least by extreme weather events. And that's going on in many developing countries around the world, and it will be a significant problem in years to come. We'll see it firstly, and these representations are already being made. We'll see it in our region with the Pacific Island nations who are very anxious. I don't know if you've seen any of the film footage of what happens there. They've got the ocean going through homes. They will eventually have to be relocated from a number of those islands in time, and where do they go? So it'll be a significant problem. It's another pressure that will come to bear, and I hope that Australia plays a progressive and intelligent role. You can imagine how offensive it is to them that we have a government that calls the science crap. It's worth going to visit them, ask them their opinion.
Yeah, good afternoon. Gary Johansson, Port Adelaide Enfield Mayor. I'd like to get back to the Automotive Transformation Task Force, which you're working on. For some period now, we've had calls to reduce the public service in South Australia. There's numbers been floated around the 4,000, give or take. I think we've got a tremendous public service. I was grateful to hear what you had to say about the quality of the public service in Australia. And I think it's a greatly underutilised resource that could be thrown up against some of these problems we're now facing with the lack of manufacturing future, particularly in this state. Do you think, rather than people talking doom and gloom with our public servants and saying we should be reducing the numbers, that reduces the tax, a small amount of tax it may reduce is nothing compared to the goodness that could be created by more effectively using these highly qualified public servants, perhaps to bolster some of this action to do with trying to preserve what manufacturing base we have, particularly around the small family businesses that tend to be lost. They're the backbone of employment in Australia, but they never seem to get real acknowledgement from government, from unions or anyone. Do you think there could be a chance that we could utilise the public servants in this state particularly better to help with job creation around small family manufacturing?
Well, of course, I completely support the policy position of the South Australian government. That was a joke. No, I'm serious. I'm employed by the South Australian government, so I'm not about to be critical of policies. The underlying problem, of course, is the fiscal constraints that all governments are working with, including, I suspect, you would feel those pressures yourself. And that's an issue that relates to the reform agenda that I was speaking about earlier. We've got to have sustainable taxation arrangements in Australia to support what we need in a public service and in public service programs with proper public policy goals. I'm not really well qualified enough to say to make observations about the structure and nature of the public service in South Australia, other than to say that my own experience has been a tremendously positive one. Of course, there are significant numbers being reduced, and I can see the dislocation that it creates and the difficulty for individuals, and I have a great degree of empathy about that. But ultimately, the government has to establish a public service structure, size, and set of objectives and purposes and programs that it thinks appropriate. And so, I've no doubt that that's what the state government is doing. I imagine there's all sorts of creative ideas about what could be done, but one of the things that I've learned is to be, Don will think this fun, Don Russell was my secretary in Canberra, and I probably put a lot of what he thought would have been silly propositions as a minister to him that perhaps weren't the most efficient expenditure of taxpayers' funds. But from my experience as a minister, my experience working outside government, my experience working in association with public servants, is you really do have to be careful with the expenditure of taxpayers' funds and be very clear and careful that you're implementing programs that are, efficient, that are properly resourced, and that have got very clear objectives and goals. And I know within the Department of State Development, that's what Don and the senior teams are endeavouring to achieve. And it is important because you can waste a lot of money if you're not careful. So they're my general observations. I don't know specifically what else I could offer you about how you can creatively use a public service for the goals that you're describing, but they are meritorious ones.
Oh.
Mario Bruno. You spoke about the word fearless, and in the past 3 or 4 forums I've heard that word fearless. How would you explain that word fearless, and how do you do that without getting unemployed?
Well, being unemployed isn't fair. The one answer I'd make. Look, fairness is obviously a subjective concept, but it's a very important value. And I think we've all got notions of what is fair and what is not fair when we look at particular circumstances. So moving your assets offshore to deny people who are dying of an asbestos disease access to compensation, I think we'd all say that's not fair. So it's subjective. However,
what about fearless? I think Mario was asking about the fearless, as in the frank and fearless advice.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you said fairness, my apologies. Fearless, I mean, I would describe that as not having, front and foremost of your mind what the minister might want to hear or what the executive of government might want to hear. Of course, you've got to be responsive to the policy positions, that's your responsibility that the government has been elected upon, but in formulating those things, the detail of a public policy position, or in responding to ministerial inquiries about responses to particular policy initiatives, I just think you've got to do your best to represent what the public service believes is an appropriate response in the circumstances, or what is the most efficient disposition of taxpayers' funds in formulating the detail of a policy, and not worrying about, too much about the politics. And you've got to be supported in that by the leadership of your department, obviously. That's critical. But you've got good leadership here. And look, I can tell you, as a minister, that's what I wanted, because I knew it would, and even to contest it, and for me to have the shits with it, or my staff to think, why don't they do what we really want? The most contestable policy propositions that are put forward that are soundly reasoned and based upon proper principles, that's what will lead you to the best public policy outcome. When ministers and secretaries of departments go to cabinet committees or something with, a submission that's kind of cooked up to meet the government's goals, that's ultimately doesn't lead to really good policy outcomes, e.g. home insulation.
Dan.
Yeah, I was going to ask a question about... Thank you very much. Dan Butler. I was going to ask a question about the closure of the auto manufacturing industry. And given the scale of it, not just in terms of immediate job losses, but the long-term potential for skill losses, capability losses, socio-economic impacts, even things like potential loss of submarine contracts and so on and so forth, combined with issues about revenue for government, fiscal issues. Are there precedents for this in Australian history? What are they? Because it seems to me this is a pretty significant crisis.
Yeah, this is a significant set of circumstances, there's no doubt about that. I think, as you're familiar with, Dan, there have been other major closures in regions of Australia, and obviously I most notably think of Newcastle, because that's where I represented in Parliament, and as a union official I was involved in the negotiation of the closure of the steelworks. I mean, proportionately that was a more significant event in that area. It's the 5th largest conurbation in Australia, so it's not insignificant, Newcastle. And it was a very large economic shock to the region. But I think most people would say that Newcastle has come through that pretty well in the last 16 years. And that's not by happenstance. BHP played a very responsible role in that. It's important to emphasise. But all stakeholders came together in a regional area with a particular culture and character. It's very different than being in a state. But they all came together, and there are a set of principles and values that were observed in the response to it. And one of them was money shouldn't be wasted, on flights of fancy, on magic solutions. Another was that as I was saying before, the most important thing you can do is support people and their community and their families, but in particular the people who are displaced, to, which are mostly in that circumstance as here, blue-collar men, possibly been working a long time in a particular area, maybe not without formal skills recognition. Actually, in the auto industry, they know mass manufacturing techniques very, very well, which is very valuable. In Newcastle, it was a different circumstance, but those people were supported. They were given options once their skills were recognised. They were given options for training and doing different things. They went into all sorts of different industries because they were equipped with the capability of doing so. Cafe owners, restaurateurs emerged from the steelworks, for example, things you wouldn't have understood or believed. You'll find people in, the Hunter Medical Research Institute that used to be in the steelworks, in sort of technical employment. It's quite interesting. They've disseminated and their skills are upgraded and they're able to participate in a rapidly diversifying local economy. So there are things. Geelong's going to face a really tough time with the closure of Ford, Shell, the removal of Qantas aviation maintenance from Avalon Airport and other manufacturing closures that are less talked about. But you've got to look ultimately to what strengths you've got, I think, to be able to respond to it. When propositions come along saying, look, we'll use the Holden site if you just give us, hundreds of millions of bucks, we'll start making another car there or something. If a proposition like that would have come along, I'd look at it very askance. What are you looking at here? You've got $6 billion a year going into minerals exploration and mine development. $6 billion and growing, with massive opportunities, dramatic potential expansion of the Cooper Basin in gas. Gas can feed other industries like chemicals and plastics. Copper mining, offshore oil exploration is going on here. If you can get people into the mine supply in goods and services, there are real opportunities to be had. So I think there's lots of good things to do, and the way that the government's restructured the Department of State Development, as difficult as it has been for people employed within the constituent departments, the re-establishment of the Economic Development Board, the committees of Cabinet dealing with economic development, that's the main game. I reckon there's reason for optimism, despite how difficult this all looks.
I like optimism on that note. Thank you, Greg. And I'll ask Michael Kay, partner of Wellman's Lawyers, to deliver a vote of thanks.
Let's hope he does a good job, eh?
Thank you, Chris, and good evening, everybody. I know what you're all thinking. It's the end of the evening and the lawyer's gotten up to speak, so you're thinking this could take a while. However, I've set myself a challenge of keeping this to 3 minutes, so let's go. Look, jokes aside, it really is a privilege and an honour to be tasked with giving this vote of thanks to Mr Combet on behalf of IPAA, all of us here, and Wellman's Lawyers. Can you hear me okay? I've got 2 microphones, I'm not sure where to look. Given my personal passion for all things IR and politics, and that I actually head up the employment law practice at Wellman's, I have genuinely enjoyed hearing some of the comments made by Mr Combet today. When asked to give this vote of thanks, I guess the irony did not escape me that Mr Combet and myself likely come from different sides of the IR spectrum, given I have made a career out of acting for employers, whereas Mr Combet, of course, has built a well-deserved reputation as being a zealous advocate predominantly for workers. But look, when I thought about that, I did think of, I guess, given this passion that we both share for IR, where the overlap is, where that shared sentiment is. And I think it's very much at the core of what IR is, and that is it's about the employees. And I know it may sound a bit trite to say, but the fact is, and I have no doubt this is the case, despite acting for the dark side, as people often remind me, is that at the end of the day, our people are everything. And it's true. Employers will not be anywhere if they did not have a workforce. The public sector is no exception. Without each and every one of you, without a public sector through which we work hard to foster, to promote, to reward excellent staff, to keep people here, in South Australia is something of critical importance, and I think we all need to really continue working to attract and retain those workers, particularly in light of the manufacturing issues which Mr Combet has raised and is currently dealing with given the task force. So look, I would like to conclude again by thanking Mr Combet for his generosity in attending today. We do appreciate it. I am calling you Mr Combet intentionally, because if I called you Greg, I might be accused of being disrespectful. But no, genuinely speaking, we are sincerely grateful. We appreciate you are a busy man, and I would like you all to join me in giving Mr Combet another round of applause. A couple more brief things, if I could. You don't get off that easily. Firstly, and this is quite genuine, if you do have a passing interest in politics or IR, which many of you would given you're here, I do strongly recommend Mr Combet's book. What I like about biographies or autobiographies is that you often do get an insight into the person. And one thing that I learnt is that I understand you're quite a fan of birds and aviaries, including the Gouldian finch, which I thought sounded like a foreign mushroom. So I Googled it and found out that it's actually quite a handsome bird. So I'm thinking about getting one. So thank you for that, Greg. But I digress, and apart obviously from thanking Mr Combet very much, which we have, thanks must go out to IPAA for hosting another fantastic event. The Don Dunstan Oration is always a fantastic event, not just because it actually is, I think, an interesting time. It's a great opportunity to network, but of course reflects the history of a truly wonderful man within state politics. And finally, of course, thanks to Renee Hayes and her team for setting up tonight. Our thanks to our excellent MC, Chris Ullman. And I think we'll just end on giving everybody a round of applause. Thank you all very much for coming.